Play Chopin. Do it well, and I'll wed my daughter to you." The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and glinting, as laughter rippled through the cavernous ballroom. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, catching the cruel delight on faces dressed in black tie elegance. The grand piano gleamed at the center of it all, untouched, waiting. Marcus Ellison froze where he stood, mop in hand, his calloused fingers tightening around the wooden handle. He had only been polishing the marble near the stage, invisible as always, when Richard Halden's voice thundered across the room. The CEO's smile was a predator's grin, wide and mocking. "Come now," Richard continued, his silver hair slicked back, his tuxedo cut sharp as a blade. "A janitor at my gala ought to earn his keep. Show us if you've got talent beyond scrubbing floors." The guests roared. A senator slapped his knee. An investment banker whispered something into his partner's ear, their champagne flutes trembling with amusement. Marcus lowered his gaze, but his body was rigid. His tall frame, usually bent into the humility of cleaning work, seemed to straighten despite himself. He didn't answer. Near the edge of the stage, Isabel Halden shifted uncomfortably, her pale skin flushed with embarrassment, not for herself, but for the man her father had chosen as tonight's entertainment. Dressed in a silk gown the color of midnight, her hands clutched her glass so tightly her knuckles whitened. She knew her father's cruelty. It was something she had endured her entire life, but tonight this felt different. Personal. "Father," she murmured, her voice low but strained. "Enough. Don't humiliate him." Richard chuckled, the sound dismissive. "Nonsense, darling. It's just sport." His icy blue eyes swept over Marcus like one might inspect a stray dog. "Well? Chopin awaits." For a moment, silence pressed in. Marcus, his dark eyes flicked to the piano, then back to the marble floor. He wanted to walk away, to swallow the insult as he had swallowed so many before. But something in him resisted. The echo of his mother's voice, the memory of his hands on ivory keys, the grief of dreams buried alive. Isabel's gaze caught his then, for the briefest flicker of a second. Her expression wasn't mocking. It wasn't pity either. It was expectant, as if she wanted him to say something. The ballroom air was thick with anticipation. The janitor, who had been nothing but background noise for years, now stood at the center of everyone's attention. Richard spread his arms like a showman. "What's wrong? Afraid?" The laughter swelled again. Marcus's throat tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he bent, set his mop against the wall, and walked slowly toward the piano. His steps were deliberate, heavy, echoing across the marble like drumbeats. The crowd hushed in surprise. "Marcus," whispered one of the catering staff at the edge of the room, wide-eyed. "What are you doing?" But Marcus didn't answer. He placed a hand on the sleek black surface of the piano, his rough fingers tracing its polished edge. He lowered himself onto the bench, his back straightening until the weight of years seemed to slip away. The silence was deafening now. Every champagne glass hovered mid-air, every eye fixed on him. He placed his hands above the keys, but did not yet play. His head lifted, and for the first time that night, Marcus met Richard Halden's gaze. His eyes, dark and steady, carried no smile. The CEO's smirk faltered. The moment stretched, fragile as glass, ready to shatter with the first note. Hours earlier, Marcus had not imagined he would even be inside this ballroom. His shift at Halden Enterprises had been extended. Too many investors in attendance, too many fingerprints and scuffs to erase before on. He had polished silver, scrubbed tiles, and carried crates through the back corridors, unnoticed, until Isabel herself had passed him in the hallway. She hadn't spoken, but she had nodded politely, her perfume lingering like lilies in spring. Marcus had bowed his head in acknowledgement, not daring to meet her eyes for long. He knew his place. Now, seated at the piano before hundreds, that memory stung like irony. Isabel's pulse quickened as she watched him. Something about the way he carried himself, the way his hands hovered above the keys, not with the uncertainty of an imposter but the poise of someone who belonged, made her chest tighten. Richard clapped his hands impatiently. "Well? Play." Marcus inhaled. His fingers, scarred from years of labor, trembled slightly as they settled into position. For a heartbeat, the ballroom was still as a tomb. And then, The first note rang out, soft and aching, floating like smoke into the air. It was Chopin. But not just Chopin played, Chopin lived. The laughter, the murmurs, the arrogance of the room, all dissolved as his hands moved, pulling melody from the silence like light from the dark. Isabel's lips parted in disbelief. Richard's jaw slackened. The crowd, once poised to laugh, now leaned forward, captive. Marcus's eyes closed as he played, the music unfurling not for them, not for applause, but for himself, for the boy he had been, for the mother he had lost, for the years stolen by poverty and struggle. Every note told a story, and the room listened. The final chord lingered like the last breath of a prayer. For a heartbeat, the ballroom was still. Then, applause did not come. Instead, whispers crackled through the air. Some guests shifted uneasily in their seats. Others forced nervous laughs, as if refusing to surrender to the spell Marcus had woven. Richard Halden broke the silence with a sharp clap of his hands. "Bravo," he drawled, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "Our janitor has hidden tricks, I see. Perhaps he moonlights in subway stations for spare change." The laughter returned, louder this time, crueler, desperate to reclaim its power. The spell shattered, and Marcus felt the weight of it crash back onto his shoulders. He lowered his hands from the keys slowly, deliberately. His chest rose and fell, but his face betrayed nothing. He had given them a piece of his soul, and still they mocked. From the head table, Isabel rose halfway to her feet. "Father, that's enough." Her voice trembled, but it carried. Heads turned toward her, surprised by her audacity. Richard's eyes flashed. "Sit down, Isabel," he ordered, his tone cold, imperious. "You don't understand the importance of this evening." Her lips parted as though to argue further, but then she pressed them shut and lowered herself back into her chair. Still, her gaze never left Marcus. Marcus stood from the bench. The murmurs of the crowd pressed against him like a tide. His chest tightened. He wanted to leave, to vanish back into the shadows where he belonged. "Impressive for a janitor," someone near the front remarked, their voice slick with condescension. "Perhaps we should replace the pianist at the Ritz with him. He'd come cheaper, no doubt." Another chimed in. "Or have him scrub the keys after. 2 talents in 1. The laughter roared again. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. For years he had endured. He had kept his head bowed, his dignity swallowed, because survival required silence. But something inside him cracked open tonight. The same something that had made him walk to the piano in the first place. He lifted his chin. His voice, when it came, was deep and steady. "I played not for you," he said, his words cutting across the laughter. "I played for the music." The room hushed. Richard tilted his head, studying him with the cold interest of a predator sizing up prey. "Careful, son," he said softly, almost amused. "Know your place." "My place?" Marcus's eyes locked onto Richard's. "I know it well. Cleaner of your mess, carrier of your weight, invisible to you until you need someone to be the butt of your jokes." A ripple of discomfort swept through the crowd. No one spoke to Richard Halden this way. No one dared. Richard rose from his chair slowly, his height commanding, his presence radiating authority. "Do you believe," he said, voice smooth as glass, "that a man like you could ever matter here? That a song could lift you above your station?" Marcus did not flinch. "I don't need your approval to matter." The words hit like stones hurled into still water, sending shockwaves through the hall. Isabel's throat tightened. She wanted to rise again, to say something, anything, that might ease the tension clawing at the room, but the sight of Marcus standing there, tall and unbroken in the face of her father's cruelty, left her breathless. He wasn't groveling. He wasn't apologizing. He was defying. And she had never seen anything more powerful. "Security," Richard said suddenly, his voice sharp as a whip crack. 2 suited men near the door stiffened and began to move forward. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Some leaned in, eager for spectacle. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the ugliness of what was about to unfold. Marcus stood still, his face unreadable. His eyes, however, never left Richard. Isabel surged to her feet. "No!" Her voice rang louder this time, firm and trembling all at once. Every head turned again. "You can't throw him out. Not after—" She faltered, struggling to steady her breath. Not after playing like that. Richard's gaze snapped to her, his expression darkening. Isabel. The single word carried a warning, an order. But she did not sit. Her hands trembled at her sides, her pulse pounding in her throat. For the first time in her life, she stood against her father in public. The silence between them crackled like fire. Marcus looked at her then, really looked. Her courage, though fragile, was real, and something in him shifted, gratitude mingling with the faintest ember of hope. But before anything more could be said, Richard raised a hand, halting the advancing guards. Very well, he said coldly. His gaze cut back to Marcus. You may stay, for now, but remember this night well. He lowered himself back into his chair, his jaw taut with fury. The musicians in the corner shuffled awkwardly, awaiting some signal. The crowd resumed its chatter, thinly veiled tension humming beneath every word. The show was over, for now. Marcus stepped back from the piano, his body tense, his breath shallow. He picked up his mop in silence, his dignity battered but not broken. But Isabel's eyes followed him, and in that gaze, Marcus felt the promise that this night was far from finished. Marcus returned to his corner of the ballroom with the mop in hand, the polished marble beneath him now gleaming brighter than ever, but the weight in the air was thicker, heavier, like smoke after a fire. His heart pounded in his chest, though his face was unreadable. The chatter of the crowd rose again, but it had changed its texture. It was no longer carefree laughter over champagne. It was whispers, sharp and cutting, laced with curiosity and disdain. Did you see the nerve of him? A woman in pearls muttered to her husband. He speaks as if he belongs here, the man replied with a sneer. Just a janitor playing dress-up on the keys. Others were less certain. A young banker whispered, I've never heard Chopin played like that. Not even at Carnegie last year. Don't be ridiculous, his colleague scoffed. You were just caught up in the drama. Marcus dipped the mop into the bucket, his movements calm, deliberate, but every word pierced him. Years of labor had given him thick skin, yet tonight, every slight felt raw. He had shown them a glimpse of his soul, and still they only saw his uniform. At the head table, Isabel's glass trembled in her hand. She had grown up in these halls of wealth and cruelty, the daughter of a man who built empires by crushing others beneath his heel. She had witnessed humiliation before, countless times, always at her father's command. But never had it stung her like this. She replayed the music in her mind. The aching rise, the mournful fall, the unspoken grief wrapped into every note. Marcus had not played like a janitor fumbling in someone else's world. He had played like a man who had lived, who had lost, who had carried weight none of these gilded guests could imagine. Her gaze drifted back to him. He mopped quietly, eyes fixed on the floor, his broad shoulders steady despite the whispers that swirled like storm clouds around him. Richard Halden, however, was not content to let the night end with a quiet defiance. His jaw flexed as he sipped his whiskey, his mind already plotting the next strike. He had built his career on control, and no janitor, no one, would ever make a fool of him in his own house. He rose again, his chair scraping across the marble. The hall fell silent at once. Richard's voice carried with the command of a man used to obedience. Ladies and gentlemen, he began smoothly, we gather tonight not only to celebrate our firm's triumphs, but to remind ourselves of what separates the great from the ordinary. He gestured toward Marcus with a casual flick of his hand, like one might toward a stray dog. What we witnessed just now was amusing, charming even, but let us not confuse novelty with greatness. The crowd chuckled obediently. Richard pressed on. Talent without pedigree, without discipline, without place. It is little more than noise. This young man, Marcus is it? He will return to his mop. And tomorrow he will polish floors again, because that is where life has placed him. The words sliced the rough the air, cruel and deliberate. Marcus froze, his hand tightening around the mop handle until his knuckles whitened. His body screamed to walk away, to silence himself as he always had. But inside, another voice rose, the voice of his mother, frail and fading in a hospital bed years ago. Don't let them bury your music, baby. Don't let them make you small. He turned slowly, lifting his head to meet Richard's gaze. His voice was quiet but steady, carrying farther than he expected. You mistake circumstance for worth. The hall hushed again. Richard arched an eyebrow. What did you say? Marcus set the mop aside and took a step forward. His tall frame seemed to grow taller under the chandeliers, his dark eyes fierce, though his voice remained calm. You think money makes you great. You think power gives you dignity. But dignity can't be bought, and greatness doesn't come from belittling others. A ripple of gasps shivered through the room. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, hungry for confrontation. Richard's smile turned icy. Careful, son, he warned, echoing his earlier threat. You're walking a thin line. Marcus's jaw tightened. I've lived on thin lines my whole life. This one doesn't scare me. The ballroom vibrated with tension. Isabel's heart pounded so loudly she thought the guests might hear it. She had never seen anyone, stand against her father like this. Executives quaked at his word. Politicians bent to his will. Yet here stood a janitor, armed with nothing but truth, and Richard looked unsettled. For the first time in years, she saw fear flicker in her father's eyes. Richard masked it quickly with a laugh, shaking his head as though Marcus's words were foolish. You're bold, I'll grant you that, but boldness without consequence is useless. Do you think anyone here will remember you tomorrow? A voice rose unexpectedly from the back of the room. I will. The crowd turned. It was the young banker from earlier, his face flushed but determined. I've been to concerts across the world. What I heard tonight? I'll remember it for the rest of my life. Murmurs broke out. Another guest added, he played better than half the so-called professionals I've paid to hear. And then, a quieter voice, hesitant but clear. Why shouldn't he matter here? The tide was shifting, slowly, painfully, but shifting. Richard's jaw clenched. His grip tightened around his glass until the ice inside cracked. Marcus said nothing. He only stood tall, his chest rising and falling, his silence louder than any argument he could make. The crowd was no longer laughing. They were watching, waiting. And Richard Halden, for the first time in memory, felt his control slipping. Richard Halden's eyes burned with fury. The murmurs in the ballroom were daggers against his pride, and each whisper felt like treason. For decades he had commanded rooms with a single glance, built empires with his voice alone. Yet tonight, his empire trembled, not because of a rival CEO or an investor, but because of a janitor with music in his hands. He set his glass down with a sharp clink. The room quieted instantly. Richard's smile returned, sharp and cold, the kind of smile that concealed a storm. Very well, he said. If our janitor fancies himself a musician, let us test him properly. Gasps rippled. Isabel's stomach tightened. She knew that tone, the false sweetness that always preceded cruelty. Richard turned to Marcus, his voice rich with condescension. Play again. Not Chopin. Something harder. Something that proves you aren't just a parlor trick. If you falter, you mop this entire hall tonight on your knees. The crowd stirred, half horrified, half thrilled at the prospect of humiliation. Father, stop! Isabel's voice trembled, but she rose to her feet. Her gown shimmered under the chandeliers, her eyes burning. This isn't a test. It isn't... Richard snapped. Sit down. Yup, Isabel. She froze, torn between fury and fear, but Marcus's calm voice cut through the tension. I'll play. The words were simple, steady, and they carried farther than any shout could. The crowd held its breath. Marcus walked back to the piano, each step heavy with resolve. His rough hands, scarred from years of scrubbing and lifting, hovered once more over the ivory keys. He inhaled deeply, remembering long nights in a cramped apartment, his mother's frail hand resting on his shoulder as she whispered, "Don't let the world take this from you." He began. Not Chopin this time, but Liszt, La Campanella. A piece notorious for its cruelty to pianists, for demanding not just speed, but soul. The opening notes rang sharp and crystalline, bells chiming through the hall. At first there were muffled chuckles, as though waiting for him to stumble. But Marcus's fingers flew, precise yet full of fire, his body swaying gently with the tide of sound. The notes cascaded like waterfalls, each one striking with clarity and passion. His scars did not slow him, his labor-hardened hands did not falter. Instead, they lent strength to every chord, force to every passage. The crowd leaned forward, breathless. Even the waiters paused with trays suspended mid-air. Isabel's hand flew to her mouth. She had heard this piece played by masters at Carnegie and Vienna, but never, never like this. His playing was not polished perfection. It was raw, burning, alive. Every mistake he might have made only sharpened the truth of it. This was a man wrestling the piano into confession, demanding it speak his grief, his hope, his humanity, and it did. By the time the final bell-like notes faded into silence, the ballroom was still as stone. No one laughed. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap, tentative, almost afraid, then another, and suddenly, applause, thunder, and echoing off the marble walls, drowning even the sound of Richard's quickened breath. Isabel rose to her feet without thinking, tears brimming in her eyes. She clapped until her hands stung. Richard remained seated, his face pale, his fists clenched tight in his lap. The applause lasted minutes, refusing to die. It wasn't just polite. It was awe, genuine and uncontainable. When at last it subsided, Marcus stood from the piano, chest heaving, his face still calm but his eyes shining with a fire none had seen before. He bowed his head slightly, not in servitude, but in respect to the music itself. And then, without looking at Richard, he turned to leave. But Isabel stopped him. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble, her gown swaying like a shadow. She reached him at the center of the hall, where hundreds of eyes burned with curiosity. "Marcus," she said softly, but her voice carried. He turned, surprised. She held out her hand, deliberate, defiant. The hall gasped as though the very air had shattered. A CEO's daughter, reaching not for wealth, not for power, but for the janitor her father had tried to make small. Marcus hesitated, his rough hands flexing at his sides, but Isabel's gaze was steady, her chin lifted high. At last, he placed his hand in hers. The gesture was simple, yet it roared louder than the applause, louder than the music, louder than Richard Halden's fury. Richard shot to his feet, his composure cracking, his face red with rage. "Isabel!" he thundered, his voice shaking the chandeliers. "Enough of this disgrace!" But she did not flinch. For the first time in her life, Isabel looked her father dead in the eye and said, "No." The word echoed like a hammer strike, and the ballroom erupted, not with laughter this time, but with gasps, cheers, whispers of disbelief. The tide had turned. The ballroom was chaos. Voices rose like a storm tide, crashing against marble and glass. Some guests clapped, cheering Isabel's defiance. Others hissed their disapproval, aghast that the daughter of Richard Halden would dare to humiliate her father in front of his empire. Richard stood rigid, his fists trembling at his sides, his pale face burning with fury. Never in all his reign had he been so defied, first by a janitor, then by his own daughter. "Isabel," he growled, his voice low but venomous. "You will let go of that man's hand, now." But Isabel's grip only tightened. She lifted her chin, her midnight gown shimmering in the chandelier's light, her eyes unwavering. "No, father." Her voice carried across the stunned hall. "I won't." Gasps erupted again. Marcus stood silent at her side, his rough hand engulfing her delicate one, his posture calm but unyielding. Inside his heart thundered, but his face was steady. He had endured poverty, humiliation, years of invisibility, but never had he imagined this, the daughter of his tormentor standing with him, publicly, fearlessly. The crowd's whispers swirled. "Does she mean it? She's throwing her life away. Halden will ruin them both." But beneath the doubt came other voices, admiring, hushed. "She's braver than he is cruel. That janitor, no, that man, he played like no one I've ever heard." The division in the room was clear, rippling like a fault line splitting marble. Richard tried to laugh, but it came out strangled. He spread his arms wide to the guests, a desperate showman scrambling to regain command. "My friends," he said, his smile twitching at the corners, "forgive this display. Youth is prone to dramatics." He turned his glare on Marcus. "This man has done nothing but exploit a moment. Don't mistake spectacle for substance. But a voice rose from the crowd, firm, male, unafraid. The young banker again. No, Mr. Halden, what we witnessed wasn't spectacle. It was brilliance. Others murmured agreement. A woman in a red gown called out, "You belittled him, and he silenced this room with music. That's more substance than any speech tonight." The applause began, not thunderous, but insistent, spreading from table to table like a growing flame. Richard's face blanched as the sound refused to die. Isabel turned to Marcus, her voice soft but resolute. "You don't have to stay here." He searched her face, uncertain. "If I leave, he'll make me pay for this." She squeezed his hand. "Then let him. He can't unmake what you've already done." Her eyes shone with something he hadn't seen in years. Belief. Belief in him. For the first time, Marcus felt taller than the chandeliers above them. Richard slammed his fist against the table, the echo silencing the room. "Enough!" His voice boomed like thunder, his composure unraveling. The great CEO, untouchable titan of steel and glass, now trembled with rage. "You think this charade makes you noble?" he spat, his glare burning into Marcus. "You're still nothing but a man who scrubs away the filth of better men." The room recoiled at the venom in his words. And then something broke. A waiter, one of Marcus's co-workers, stepped forward from the shadows, tray still in hand. "Better men?" he said, his voice trembling but loud enough to carry. "I've worked for you 10 years, sir. I've seen Marcus stay late to clean up the messes your guests leave behind. I've seen him lend his paycheck to co-workers when their children were sick. You call him nothing, but to us—" His voice cracked. "He's the best of us." The words hung heavy in the air. More voices joined in. "I've heard him play late at night when he thought no one was listening. He fixes things when they break, even when it isn't his job. He treats people with respect, more than I can say for you, Mr. Halden." The tide surged, stronger than before. A chorus of truths, spilling from the mouths of the invisible workers who had always gone unnoticed in Halden's empire. Richard staggered back a step, his mask cracking, his control slipping further with every word. Marcus's chest ached. He had braced himself to stand alone. But now, voices rose beside him, behind him, around him, voices that refused to let him be small again. Isabel turned to her father, her voice trembling but fierce. "You wanted to shame him. Instead, you've shamed yourself." The ballroom erupted, not with applause this time, but with the raw hum of realization. Executives shifted uneasily. Investors whispered to one another, doubt spreading like wildfire. Richard Halden's empire wasn't collapsing tonight, but the first cracks had appeared. And everyone had seen them. At the center of it all, Marcus stood tall, Isabel's hand in his. His silence spoke louder than fury. He didn't gloat, he didn't smile. He simply endured, his dignity unshaken, while Richard Halden drowned in his own humiliation. The underdog had not just survived, he had shifted the room. The ballroom had shifted. Where once Richard Halden's voice had ruled like law, now murmurs of dissent gnawed at the edges of his authority. His empire was still standing, but it shook under the weight of doubt. Richard's face was pale, the veins in his temples standing out. His glass of whiskey sat untouched, the ice melted into water. He had been cornered before, but never like this, never in his own house, before his own guests, before his only daughter. He tried to summon his voice, but when he did, it cracked. "Enough of this circus, This is not what Halden Enterprises stands for." But the words rang hollow, no one applauded, no one raised a glass. Instead, the silence stretched, accusing, heavy. Marcus stood calm in that silence. He didn't gloat, didn't push, didn't need to. The dignity in his silence, the steadiness of his presence, was indictment enough. Isabel still held his hand, her back straight, her chin high. Her eyes burned with quiet defiance. She had feared her father her whole life, had been groomed to follow his word without question. Yet standing beside Marcus, she felt something new unfurl inside her. Courage. Her voice broke the silence, low but firm. "What Halden Enterprises stands for," she said, "is what you've shown tonight, Father. Pride, cruelty, arrogance. That's not greatness." Gasps rippled. Richard turned to her, horror flashing across his face. Isabel, no. The single word stopped him cold. You've used me as an ornament all my life, a daughter to parade, to control. But tonight, I'm not your pawn. She glanced at Marcus, then back at her father. And you will not tear down someone greater than you just to protect your pride. The ballroom thundered with whispers. For the first time, Richard Halden looked small. The young banker spoke again, his courage growing bolder. Mr. Halden, forgive me, but what happened tonight will be remembered. Not your speech, not your gala. Him. He gestured toward Marcus. The janitor you tried to humiliate. He made us all feel something you couldn't. A murmur of agreement swept the crowd. Richard's mask cracked, his chest heaved, his pride screamed for him to roar, to destroy, to reassert himself. But the weight of the room pressed him down. His allies avoided his eyes. Investors he had courted with wine and wealth now shifted uneasily, their loyalties wavering. And then, with a sound like something breaking, Richard's voice faltered. He swallowed, his throat tight. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. Was wrong. The words were quiet, almost inaudible, but in the silence of the hall they struck like thunder. Gasps echoed. Some disbelieved. Others leaned forward, hungry for more. Richard's shoulders sagged, his steel mask shattering. His voice cracked again, raw and stripped of command. I wronged you. His eyes icked to Marcus, then darted away, unable to hold the man's gaze. I spoke without honor. I mocked what I did not understand. A hush fell deeper. Isabel's lips parted in disbelief. Never in her life had she heard her father say those words. Not to her, not to anyone. Richard's knees bent, and before the glittering eyes of Chicago's elite, the titan of industry lowered himself, slowly, painfully, until he was kneeling on the polished marble floor. The crowd gasped, as if the world itself had tilted. I ask your forgiveness, Richard whispered hoarsely. His words shook, his pride splintering. I beg it. Marcus's chest tightened. The sight was surreal. The man who had mocked him, crushed him, called him nothing, now kneeling before him, trembling. But Marcus did not rush to answer. He stood still, letting the moment breathe, letting the enormity of it settle. His silence was not cruelty, it was truth. When at last he spoke, his voice was low but steady. I don't need your kneeling. I don't need your apology. His eyes softened, though his posture remained firm. What I needed was to be seen. Tonight you did everything you could to strip me of dignity. And still, here I stand. That is enough for me. The room held its breath. Marcus bent slightly, extending a hand, not to raise Richard as an equal, but as a gesture of mercy. Stand, Mr. Halden. Don't kneel to me. Stand, and remember this night. Remember that greatness doesn't come from what you own, but what you honor. Richard's breath shuddered. Slowly he took Marcus's hand and rose, his face hollow, broken, yet strangely human. The applause came then, not wild, but steady, reverent. For Marcus, for his strength, his mercy, his unshakable dignity. Isabel's eyes shimmered with tears. She whispered, barely audible, You've changed everything. Marcus said nothing. He only lowered his gaze, the weight of why, ears lifting at last, leaving him lighter than he had ever been. The gala ended not with fireworks or champagne toasts, but with the slow, stunned exodus of guests who whispered to one another as though they had witnessed history. Chandeliers still glittered above, the quartet packed away their instruments in silence, and the marble floor, where Richard Halden had once knelt, remained the only thing people looked at when words failed them. Outside, the Chicago night was cold, crisp, humming with distant traffic. The air carried the faint smell of rain. Marcus stepped into it first, his jacket slung over his arm, his body loose with exhaustion. He had endured much in his life, but tonight had taken something more than strength. It had taken his soul and bared it before strangers. Beside him, Isabel walked quietly, her gown whispering against the pavement. For once she wasn't watched, wasn't scrutinized. Her father's shadow no longer defined her steps. She looked at Marcus with a warmth that went beyond gratitude. You didn't just play tonight, she murmured. You freed me. Marcus tilted his head, studying her. Freed you? Yes. Her voice was steady, though soft. All my life I thought power meant never bending, never admitting weakness. Tonight, I saw the truth. Power is grace. And you had it, even when everyone else tried to strip it from you. Marcus didn't answer immediately. His eyes wandered upward, where the city lights drowned out all but the brightest stars. A long breath escaped him. Funny thing is, I wasn't playing for them, he said finally. Not your father, not his guests. I was playing for my mama. She used to hum Chopin while she scrubbed the kitchen floor, said it kept her dreaming. I wanted her to know I hadn't forgotten. Isabel's throat tightened. She slipped her arm into his, not as a gesture of ownership but solidarity. She would have been proud. Inside, Richard Halden remained alone in the hollow. Grandeur of his ballroom. His tie hung loose, his glass of whiskey now untouched and irrelevant. He sat slumped in a chair, the echoes of Chopin still haunting the walls. For the first time in decades, silence frightened him more than failure. His mind churned, not with schemes, not with strategies, but with regret. He saw himself as the boy he once had been, poor and hungry, vowing never to be humiliated again. And he saw Marcus, a man who had endured humiliation and walked away taller. Richard's lips pressed thin. He whispered into the empty hall, words no one would hear but the marble and the ghosts. I was wrong. Days turned to weeks. The story spread, not just within elite circles, but through the city. People whispered of the gala where a janitor humbled a king. Some dismissed it as rumor, others recounted every detail as gospel. Investors shifted loyalties. A few even reached out to Marcus, offering him opportunities in places he had never dreamed he would be welcomed. Yet Marcus didn't chase them. He returned to his quiet life, sweeping floors, tuning pianos on the side, living with the same quiet dignity he always had. Fame did not tempt him. Validation had already been found. One morning, however, a letter arrived. The handwriting was jagged, unpracticed. Inside, a simple note. Mr. Lee, you may not forgive me, I cannot ask it, but I wish to learn. If you would allow me, I want to hear you play again, this time not as a test, but as a man asking another to teach him what grace sounds like. Richard Halden. Marcus read the note twice, then tucked it away in a drawer. He neither accepted nor rejected it. Some wounds take time. Some lessons take longer. As for Isabel, she did not fade back into her father's shadow. She pursued her own path, philanthropy rooted not in spectacle but in service. She visited community centers, funded music programs in neglects, TED neighborhoods, and often asked Marcus to guide her, to keep her grounded. At one such center, weeks later, Marcus sat at a battered, upright piano surrounded by children. His fingers drifted over Chopin once more, not for ballrooms but for wide-eyed kids who leaned close, watching in awe. Isabel stood in the back, a gentle smile on her face, her heart swelling at the sight. The melody filled the room. Warm, imperfect, alive. One boy whispered to another, "He plays like it's talking to us." Marcus overheard. His lips curved into the smallest, quietest smile. That night, when the keys stilled and the children had gone home, Marcus sat alone with the piano. His reflection wavered in the glossy lid, tired eyes, calloused hands, a man shaped by hardship, yet softened by music. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to close his eyes and whisper, "Mama, I kept the dream." And in the hush of the empty hall, it almost felt like she answered back. The world moved on, as it always does. Empires rose and fell, fortunes shifted, scandals burned bright and then dimmed. But in one corner of Chicago, a black janitor with music in his soul reminded a city, reminded even a hardened titan, that true greatness was never bought, never forced, never inherited. It was played, note by note, with dignity that could not be silenced. And that was the story people remembered.